Okay, class. With this slideshow, it is going to be Mesopotamia, the Rise of Civilization 1. Uh, I'm picking this out a little bit out of order, but it's the best place to start with this subject because it is the earliest culture to become a civilization, which I'll explain in a moment. And it has the full range of what we mean by that. So it's a good one to concentrate on, and then we'll go and look at some other cultures that emerged at the beginning of the Bronze Age. Now, civilization is a dicey word. We don't think of it as civilized. This means, versus, you know, rude or primitive. It's not being used in that way. It just means, in anthropological terms, far more complex societies with social hierarchies, as I just discussed before, the uneven distribution of wealth, etc. And it starts in in lower Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia are the two big rivers that are now in Iraq, the Tigris and Euphrates, and they are big rivers. I've crossed the northern parts of both when they go make it into Turkey, and even that far upstream, they're still really wide rivers. These are like the Mississippi, right? These are Hudson. These are big, big, big rivers. Maybe not as big as the Hudson, but it's pretty big. And we get our first cities and urban centers in Sumeria, which is at the very bottom right of the slide, where it shows places like Uruk, Umma, it's an for example. And these are our earliest cities. You're probably familiar with from Abraham and the Bible, and I'll show you that later on. But here we start to get our first urban settings. And for example, here's one of the earliest sites that has it, Eridu. I point this out right here just to show you that with these sites there are many, many levels of construction, one on top of another, another on top of another, another on top of another. So frequently during the excavations, they would have to dig, down into these buildings quite a bit to get at the earlier levels, because people just continued to redo primarily the temples at these sites and build over top of them. So the stratigraphy is pretty complex, and we'll see that there's large royal palaces. And if you have palaces, you have people in charge and people below, and the accumulation of wealth within the palaces, etc. As we see with hierarchical societies. And we get our first writing in the world here in Sumeria, southern Mesopotamia, and we see some pretty simple texts right here. Which just have these are one thing I do know about these is the holes and those notches are numerals of some sort, and then we can see the writing around those circles, and that's the script of cuneiform. Cuneiform gets its name from the use of a wedge-shaped reed. Kunos just means wedge-shaped. And they would take these wedge-shaped reeds, and then they would take a piece of clay that had been sort of cleaned a little bit. It's called levigation, sort of similar to what you do with clay for pottery, where you sort of clean out the impurities, and you get a nice tablet here. And then you make impressions with this wedge-shaped stylus. And the different combinations of impressions have different phonetic values, just like we have with A is A, B is B, etc. These have different phonetic values. The decipherment of this was done in Behistun by a guy by George Rawlinson, and I believe I've discussed that already, and I will bring it up again in later classes. But it was this language was deciphered pretty early on, after Egyptian hieroglyphs, but second, I think, only to it. And there was a big inscription in northern Iran, a place called Behistun, where they had an inscription in Persian, which is a language we could read, and then other ones in cuneiform. It's a trilingual, similar to the Rosetta Stone. But once again, I'll show you slides of that later on. So they would take this wedge and they would impress it with this combination of wedges, and they would make tons of tablets, tons of tablets. I'm not, this isn't like we have a handful of these. We have tens of thousands of them. And there's a whole bunch, for example, in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, that, have been there for over half a century, if not more, and still haven't been read. There's so many of them. Now, granted, this is hard stuff to read. There's only a handful of people in the world that can read it. But there's a lot of research to be done. And when, during the Iraq, when the turmoil was very bad in Iraq, sites were getting looted like crazy. And crates of tablets would be taken out and sold on the illegal antiquities market. But I show you these here. The ones on the top are interesting because we even see that they made letters out of them. That is to say, they would type something, you would write something on a tablet, then they put it in a kiln and fire it. And then they would take it out and then they would enclose that in clay, like an envelope, and even put some information on the envelope and then fire it again. So when the person who received it got it, he or she just had to crack it like a hard-boiled egg, and the note was inside. The bottom right, we see a shot from an excavation of a site called Ebla, and just, where they're finding, they'd have some summers where they're finding 10,000 tablets. Right before the last Iraq war started, 2003, right, the summer before that, there was a site that produced 800 tablets, in just this like one summer excavation. So there was a lot of writing. And what's really impressive about this is that if there's so much writing, it means a lot of people were quite literate. A lot of people were quite literate. And this is quite early on, starting around 3000. And I'll come back to that concept later. So we get tablets like that. Later on, we'll get prisms. These things, these are used a bit later in Mesopotamian history, not right at the beginning. But these are tall, like 3 or 4 feet high. They can be taller, and they have a whole bunch of writing down each sort of flat face of them. And so these were records to be observed, to be looked at and read. So it's and laws, etc. So we can presume that a lot of people were illiterate. You don't put up, big signs with messages on it if you don't assume people can read. And once again, just to show you, just the tons of tablets, just tons of them. And unfortunately, a lot of them are, like shopping lists and stuff like that. None are, a lot of them are very boring. But as we'll see in the next slideshow, we can start getting epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has similarities to what we later see in Homer. So echoes of it in Homer for the Epic of Gilgamesh. But we'll talk about that later. But this is just some more of the evidence. And of course, we got our seal stones, our cylinder seals, and these cylinder seals are Mesopotamian type of seals. These were supposed to roll onto clay. There's a hole down the center of them from top to bottom, and a string would have been put through them, and they were worn as a bracelet or a necklace. And we find tons of these. And what's interesting about them is that for them to function, as I discussed in an earlier class, no two can be identical, because it's sort of a way of it's sort of like a signature, right? Your stamp on something shows that it's yours or from you. Just want to point out, here we see this one on the right, that's a cylinder seal, upper right, and we see the impression when it's rolled along the clay. I just want to show you this because later on, when we get to Egypt, we're going to talk about the Narmer palette, which we see up here, upper left. But those animals, the serpents, come. The idea comes from Mesopotamia, and so there'll be connections in between them because, as we'll see with this Narmer tablet, this is quite early and shows the unification of two parts of Egypt and starts the Bronze Age dynasties. Here's another one which you roll along, get the impression, and what's fun about this is it shows us a big building or a ziggurat, as you will see in a little bit, and then some sort of deity sort of floating there beside it. The deity is the person is so large that it's way too large to be a human in comparison to the building, but perhaps that suggests it's a deity. Notice that the animals running around as well, right below him, and so it gives you an idea that the proportions and the scales aren't precise. Now back to our seal impressions. Okay, so this is what these seals how they could work. This is on a signet ring, right? But they don't have to be a ring, but there are rings, and you can see you impress it on the clay. And what you could do is, if you had, let's say, a leather document, and a lot of these have been found, you put a string around the document, then you tie a knot, and then you put the clay on the knot. And that doesn't prevent anybody from opening up the document, but you'll know if it's been tampered with. And so they could put these strings around letters, they'd put these strings around, let's say, claws that are closing, tight, some sort of jar, etc. One good example of this is the Tutankhamun's tomb in Egypt, which we'll talk about later on. When Carter found it, he knew it had not been robbed because not only were the doors tied shut, but the seal was still on it, and that clay went over the knot, so nobody could sort of untie it, go in, take some stuff, and then go back out and retie it as if it's never been robbed. And perhaps you've heard the expression in the Bible, when there's like a festival and people want to celebrate, they say, go break the seals of the grain room. Well, what that means is that the grain rooms have been sealed shut, that nobody's allowed to get into them. And when you break the seals, you open up the room or the vessel that it might go over. And once again, just, a ton more of different types of seals to make the seal impressions. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes. The cylinder ones, once again, roll. And these are purely a Near Eastern type. And you can see in the one on the right, a string would have gone through that hole on the top and been worn around as a necklace. It's only about an inch tall. I have examples of these that usually, if we were in person in class, I'd pass around replicas of these sort of things. But these are quite common in the Bronze Age. Now, one other interesting thing that out of many interesting things that have been found in Mesopotamia, and we'll talk more and more about them, were these ships here, or these boats. Now, I bring this up I have a sort of personal reason here, because this is always the sort of vessel that's shown to show the earliest ability to sail. There's a sort of a football-shaped, pot, and it has this socket coming out of it, and it was thought, so they reconstructed it by putting that sail in, and then or the mast in, and then strings down to the four sides. Those, by the way, those strings were, or masts were not with it when it was found. This is their interpretation of it. I've argued in publication that it's not that at all, but in fact, it's something used while making in textile production. And this gives you an idea, just as a drawing of it without that supposed mast, and what it looks like. It's only about, no longer than a foot left or right. It's not that big. But we know from it, and notice, by the way, also the piece going from the top to the bottom there on the one side, that's a loop. And I think that these things are actually used as in textile production because when you're trying to spin wool, you frequently have to get it wet in order to get it nice and tight. And so you draw strings through through that hole in the bottom. We see this Egyptian example, and they're spinning the thread, so it then can be applied to the loom in the middle, this vertical loom. Actually, I shouldn't say this. It's actually a horizontal loom. It's been lifted up, and so we see it sort of from an aerial perspective, but then the people are from profile. Egyptian art does this a lot, where they mix perspectives, but you get the idea across. It gets the idea across. Now, there's also the great site of Once again, you are probably I'm sorry, Uruk here rather. I'm sorry. You're probably familiar with Uruk because that's where the Gilgamesh, which I hope you've read, that's where he is king. And you know, it's there's the excavations there have produced quite a lot. Interestingly enough, we didn't even know about Gilgamesh till about 150 years ago, and it wasn't even taught when I was in undergrad, late 70s, early 80s. But now everybody's reading it, and it's good, and it's something that archaeologists have discovered and deciphered, and there's a lot of hints that of what we will later on see in Homer. But in any case, we have a bunch of large buildings. It's quite a city. We have this stone head of, we believe to be the goddess Inanna, goddess of love, also be known as Ishtar. This is, if you remember in Gilgamesh, he gets into a fight with her, and that's what causes all of his problems. He refuses to sleep with her. She's a goddess of love, and so she makes his life miserable. And so we see this wonderful, very human-looking sculpture here of this deity. The eyes are missing because precious stones would have been put there, and so this is a statue of some sort of this deity we believe to be Inanna or Ishtar, that would have been in the temple to her there. And here we just see the layouts of this site here. I just want to point out the complexity of it. But then in this turn to of the site of Uruk, and once again, there's a statue of Inanna here. She has her own. She's this important deity for this city. Notice in the blue in the middle we see the ziggurats, and I'll show you soon what ziggurats are. But at this site was found the this what's called the Warka vase. The modern name for the Uruk, the modern name of the town is Warka, and this is very important because we see three registers here. The bottom register has plants and then animals. The bottom register is split into two sub groups. Then the middle, we see naked men going the opposite direction from right to left. So not the same way the animals are going on the bottom left to right, and they're naked. And they're carrying offerings that would be brought up to the top register. And there's a priest there, and he's a bit bigger than the naked men, showing hierarchical scale, or hieratic as it's called. And these offerings are given to a statue of Ishtar or Inanna. And that's in the dead center there. That's a statue of her. And we know it because of the symbols behind her. Those two rods with the circles at the end are associated with her. And then there's all the goods behind her that have been put into the temple. And they're sort of stacked up, one on top of the other. And when they're in top, that means that they're behind. And here's just another shot of the Warka vessel. Now, what's important about this is that it shows our first definite religious activity. We might have had references to religion in the cave painting, let's say, but we don't know that for sure. but this one we definitely know for sure. So we're seeing that religion is going to play a really important part in these early civilizations and might even be what sort of controls these societies. And once again, just to show you on the map where these sites are, in the bottom here in Sumeria, and you can see I'm taking up Uruk again here, the location of it. And here's one of the temples that was found in it early on in the excavations. Just to give you an example of how deep it was there, and the plan of the temple. We'll talk more about this architecture as we go on. We'll talk about ziggurats, etc. I do want to point out, though, that Warka vase that I just showed you with the first ritual, that was stolen with the in 2003 with the sacking of the looting of the Baghdad Museum in April of 2003, right after America invaded Iraq the second time. And it was taken, unfortunately, and it was smashed. The most of it was found, though, again, and it was found in a toilet, well, basically. So that's sort of disgusting. The thing is that the people that broke into these museums and took them didn't realize that they were taking pieces that are in all the art books, right? And the art history books. And so no museum's going to touch it because they're obviously, they're very, so famous, everybody will know that it was stolen. And here we see this poor guy, Donnie George, at the Baghdad Museum. I actually met him. He's passed away a couple of years ago. But I met him, and he was a friend of a good Iraqi friend of mine who's an archaeologist. So that's being slowly put back together. But we will continue on with Mesopotamia in the next lecture.